I just watched this Brian Eno and Zane Lowe interview on Apple Music, and I found it to be really inspiring, and I think you can learn from what they talked about a little bit here in this video. So overall, the reason this interview was done is to talk about Brian Eno's new album, Forever and Ever No More. It's a very interesting album, and if you've never heard Brian Eno's work, he has a huge history behind him, and he talks about this in the interview, but he talks about this album, and he also talks about his working style and talking about how he has learned from Fred Again, British DJ and producer, somebody he used to mentor. Let's dive into a little bit about what was so cool about this interview and all the really inspiring information within. So Zane starts the interview by saying that he knows Brian doesn't really like to talk about his past, and he doesn't really like to take too much time looking towards the past. Brian responds to this by saying that the reason for this is that he has a pretty big history. Like I said, he has a lot of weight that is carried under his name. He's the person who coined the term ambient music. He's done a lot of really big soundtracks for films over the years. He's brought these abstract concepts to contemporary music, and just he's done a lot of different styles of music. He's been releasing a lot of music since the mid-70s. He says that there's a tendency in the world for people to want to watch him do the same thing over and over again, and it creates an anchorage. He uses the term anchorage that he doesn't enjoy. And he talks about how he always says that people congratulate him for the album that he did 20 years ago. And he doesn't like this specifically because he says, for two reasons. One, he asks, was it better? Was that album from 20 years ago better? And have I deteriorated since then? And also, what I was doing all that time ago, was that the best I could have done? He goes on to say that what he wants to always be doing, and what is a thrill for him to do, is to work at the edge of his understanding, always pushing and learning more and trying new things. And it goes to show throughout his work because he has such a broad, captivating music discography that has all these different production styles, exploring different instruments and genres, and some of those genres he kind of invented. He says that he understands why people like to ask that question, and he responds by saying that he hopes people understand why he doesn't like to answer the question. So when they go on to talk about the album, Zane and Brian both agree that execution is the hardest thing, trying to get your ideas out. And he says that beginnings are easy and they get easier and easier as time goes on, but endings are always hard. He quotes Picasso. I don't know the quote exactly, but I'll put it here on the screen. He says, "Nothing is worse than a great beginning." He also goes to talk about this really interesting story, and it applies to music today and how it's created. He talks about how there's so many ways to get started today with modern tools, from Ableton, all the softwares, beat makers, even iPhone apps, like Soundtrap, all these different modern tools that we have that are really easy to help you get started. There's a lot of ways to get something that's pretty respectable very early on in the process. And he uses this story about an architect and how in the time when a lot of businesses were starting to use computers for their work, this architecture firm, they were very reluctant to go to computers, not simply for the fact that it's technological advancement and they were scared of that, but for the artistic impact and the soul of the stuff that they were creating. And he uses this term here called premature sheen. Best way I can describe it in the music sense is take a really terribly recorded piece of music, but then put a bunch of effects on it to try to make it look really cool. What it goes to show is that even though the underlying art is not really there, it's not really fully developed, there's everything on top of it to embellish it and make it look pretty. And that's the premature sheen. He says that there's a lot of premature sheen to go around when it comes to today's music tools, but it's important to understand the inherent art, the inherent soul you're trying to put through the music or art in general. So it really made me think, it was making me think about what's the premature sheen I put on the music that I create, the effects that I use, the things that I try to cover up with reverb or vocal tuning or something like that. And it made me think, it made me step back and be like, well, what am I really trying to say in my music? What am I really trying to do with my music? How is it holding me back from actually creating good art that represents my point of view? He goes on to talk about art and play and how when we're young, a child playing is their work. When we get older, we stop calling the things that we're doing play. We're not just playing anymore. We're creating art, or we're going to the movie and we put these labels on it. It was making me think, well, why do I do this? Why do I like to make music? Have I lost the sense of play that I had when I first started making music as a child? Sometimes it's hard to get back into that emotion of just pure play and enjoyment and creativity and feeling like you're in another world, because we try to put all these labels on the things that we're doing, such as trying to make money with it, trying to grow a follower list, trying to get streams. Am I playing, or am I just stressing myself out unnecessarily? And how can I get back to that feeling of play through my music to really have fun with it? Brian and Zane also go on to talk about British DJ and producer Fred again. And if you haven't heard of him, or if you haven't listened to his music, definitely go check it out. He's a really talented and very interesting artist. Brian Eno and Fred have a history together because I don't know the full story, but I guess years ago when Fred was younger, he would actually get some sort of lessons. He would spend time working with Brian, and Brian was like a mentor to him. This sense of childlike play was brought up when Zane and Brian go on to talk about Zane's other Apple Music interview that he did with Fred again. They were talking about how Fred said that Brian had this sort of childlike curiosity about him, and how he also calls him a mentor. And then Brian responds to this by saying that, well, Fred is a mentor to him as well. And he says that the first time they worked together, he could see that Fred was brilliant. Brian says that he started listening to music differently when he heard his music and learned about how he works. He learns a lot about contemporary music from Fred as well. He calls him a very sensitive and talented artist, and he didn't really understand what he was doing originally. He says that Fred's way of working is almost entirely different than his way of working, and it taught him a lot. Fred's way of working apparently is not linear, and he goes on to explain this by saying that most people would take a basic arrangement and then fill it with things to make it sound cool, where Fred doesn't do that. He goes bit by bit and takes the song wherever it feels natural to him and whatever interests him, and it allows for him to create music that does not follow normal boundaries, and it's clearly audibly different than other popular song structures. And they also both go on to talk about how they love how Fred uses his phone to go record, and he records voice memos, and he records out in the world where there's a lot of noises and there's the sounds of the city. And they talk about how Fred doesn't just clean that off like with a lot of audio restoration softwares or anything like that. He leaves that stuff in because it has a context to it. There's like a point of history that's built into that audio. It is a really interesting way of working, and an interesting way of taking what's out in the world and putting it into a musical idea. So yeah, I really appreciate you sticking around to watch me talk about this. If you are an Apple Music subscriber, go ahead and watch that interview, and go ahead and listen to Brian Eno's new album. Let me know what your thoughts are about some of these ideas that we were talking about today. I thought it was really interesting to hear Brian's take, because I've never heard an interview from him actually, and he's a very well-spoken, detailed, just thoughtful person. I definitely strive to have his kind of perspective, especially as I go on in my music career. Thanks a lot, guys. My name's Dan from One Channel Productions. Have a good day.